Okay, thank you. So I will start. I'll just talk very briefly. This is a paper with Hector Labat. As Ryan said, he's a PhD candidate at the University of Sorbonne North and UFRJ and my university. He spent 1 year in co-tutel and co-supervisor. And he's trying, I think, something that was discussed yesterday. He's trying to combine this growth account perspective from Spain with the French regulation theory. And the other chapters of his thesis are more related to these financial elements, so which I will not discuss much here. So very briefly, the outline of the presentation, this there will be an introduction. I'll talk very briefly also on the supermultiplier theory and demand-led growth accounting. Our general and more specific results for the three phases of growth found in the Spanish economy. Finally, a brief discussion with the literature and some concluding remarks. Very briefly also, as it was mentioned yesterday, demand-led growth is central to post-Keynesians, defined as a broad sense, in which these references are included from at least these authors, and is applied in more specific cases to this growth regime, drivers of growth research, as you saw yesterday, and the comparative political economy, and also the Russian or supermultiplier demand-led growth accounting. And so the aim of this paper, I think it's two objectives. The first one is to apply this demand-led growth accounting to the Spanish economy. And again, I agree that more broader comparison with a pool of countries would be interesting, and there are some attempts with not so broad selection as in this paper, in the first selection of papers from the advanced economies, some Latin American countries and some BRIC countries that we'll see after, and also for single countries as the US economy, Brazil and Portugal are some. So the Spanish economy will enter as one single country, which of course is the opposite idea to make a pool of comparative view of different patterns of growth. But on the other hand, I think we can have, first, because it was never done, this kind of exercise for the Spanish economy. And second, because I think there's a contribution here, which is methodological, in the sense that you are including in the autonomous components of demand, the consumption out of public transfers and out of public wages. Out of public transfer, it was done by Guilherme Alusca, but in a paper in Portuguese, and out of public wages, there's just one theoretical discussion in Serrano and Pimentel, but also a paper that was not published. It was just presented in a conference. So we're trying to implement this in this both of these contributions in the demand-led growth accounting. So you also compare our results with the alternatives. Well, very briefly, the supermultiplier accounting as an alternative from the demand-led perspective to, for example, the supply-side growth accounting, as it's common seen from the neoclassical economists like Solow, etc. And the idea is that you assume that the growth is demand-led, and also you assume some relation, you decompose the growth as explained by this demand-led component. So you assume this as the supply side assumes that it's the supply side that is driving the growth. And the second is the supermultiplier part of it, in the sense that it's a theoretical informed decomposition in which you separate the induced components, which are the related, systematically related to the production process, and the autonomous components. So in our view, the induced components of demand will be the contractual wages, the private wages generated by production, and also the private business investment, which in a longer run than consumption is provided to increase capacity of the economy. And the other components will be autonomous. And you have this, I think I'll move a little bit quicker. We saw yesterday, you have the supermultiplier here with the induced parameters, and the Z, which is the sum of the autonomous components, which are autonomous consumption, residential investment, government spending, exports, and the consumption of transfers, public transfers and public wages. And so the decomposition, you have the growth rate of the economy will be explained by the sum of both the contribution of the autonomous demands, the growth of autonomous demand given the supermultiplier, and also the growth or the changes of the components of the supermultiplier. What we introduce here as just very briefly the idea to incorporate consumption out of public transfers and wages is that this, for the theoretical, from the theoretical perspective, this is seen not as a source related with the production process, as it is defined by institutional political settings in the economy. Although it's an income, so yesterday, sometimes the induced and autonomous is defined by related to income, but maybe here is just to clarify that the income generated in the production process. So this is not the case of the transfers, public transfers and public wages. And the idea of public wages is that you have three effects. The first one is that when the government pay public wages, it's contracting at the same time service, in general service that will be counted as part of the public sector GDP, for example, public education. Second, the wages will work as a transfers to the households or to the public servants that will spend according to an average propensity to consume. And finally, this consumption out of public wages will have this own supermultiplier effects, as the public servants will buy goods and services from the private sector, and also the other induced effects that we saw in the supermultiplier. Well, moving quickly to our results. The first thing, I think it's not something very new, just looking at the data, you can divide the Spanish patterns of growth in three different ones. One is a boom period from 1999 until 2007. Then you have two crises, and first the great financial crisis, and then the Eurozone crisis, where you have a recession in terms of growth. And finally, you have a more moderate recovery, which is from 2014 to 2019, as we decided to not talk about the COVID period, because we are more interested in more medium run, medium to longer run patterns. And we know that things were very volatile in this 2 years that maybe can include now the third year, the COVID, post-COVID. Okay, we made two ways. We separate in 2 ways our demand components. First is between the group of autonomous demand and the group that are induced components of demand. And we divided this for each contribution to each of these components to growth. And then we also divided it in the net contribution of institutional sectors. And then we group in public, private, and external sectors. So just to give you an idea what these are our results, it's just a table in which you have here the years and the periods. And here you have the contribution to growth of each of one of these single components, the groups of autonomous and induced components of demand, and here the net contributions of the institutional sectors. Just to show, so you have first this pattern of more faster growth rates in 1998 to 2007. Then you have a recession in which the GDP in average decrease 1% a year. And finally, you have a more moderate recovery compared to the boom period that lasts from 2014 to 2019. In terms of the general contributions to growth, we have here, this is from the whole period from 1998 to 2019. So we can see, for example, in terms of net contributions, that the public sector has the main contribution to growth compared after to the external sector and finally to the private sector. But of course, this results depends on not only on the growth rates of each of these group of components, but also on the share they have on the economy. So the private sector for example, the private autonomous demand is the share is much lower than the other, as we'll see here in the first, in the second graph here. So we have the share is important for these results. So other general results that we have from this whole period is that exports and public sector have the most important contributions to autonomous demands. They also, these exports and the consumption of out of public transport and public wages provides a stability to the growth rates, as they do not change very much the contribution in each period. Finally, you have always a downward trend of the supermultiplier, and meaning that the supermultiplier as whole contributed negatively to growth in this period. And you have some patterns that you can see that the private wage share decreases almost as a trend in this period from 1998 to 2019. It's of course a result of weak bargaining power of work in more general sense. We try to provide some features that can cause this in the Spanish economy, institutional and political explanations. Second, you have an upward trend of the propensity to import. Of course, there's also some explanations as participation in global value chains or change in the composition of demand. And finally, the investment share, as we consider the business, private business investment share, as we consider it an induced component and related with the growth rate of the economy. Of course, if you pass from a period with higher growth rates, you will have from a lower growth rates, you have a change, a decrease in this parameter. So I'll change here, I'll show here the trend of the supermultiplier. We calculate here this, I think, brown line, and the other components that can explain this trend here. This is the relation between the private business induced investment share over GDP and the GDP growth, which means that the higher is the growth rate of GDP, the higher will be the share of investment on GDP, which is something that is you can see in the theoretical model these results, and now it is confirmed here in the data as very correlation, simple correlation and scatter plots. But also there are some econometric studies on this. Well, the three phases of growth. The first, our results shows that in the boom period, although you have this housing or a residential investment boom and a housing bubble, in the end, the public sector, the institutional sector, is the most important net contribution to growth. This, of course, has to do with the share of the public sector, which is much greater than the residential investment on demand, but also because the growth rates of the contribution was important from the public sector, as we see. And finally, that autonomous demand growth was driven mainly by public spending and external demand, and then private demand in terms of autonomous. And of course, the supermultiplier followed the same pattern in this period. So here we have the results. So just to show this main one is that the public sector from this 3.7, the public sector contributed to almost 2%, and then the private sector with 1.5, and the external sector with only 0.2, which happened because you have, although you had a strong contribution of exports, you also have a lot of induced imports in this period, because also have an increase in the investment share, so which brings together a lot of imports. 2018, 2013, the crisis and recession. This is, I think, of course, you have a collapse in the private sector demand. You also have, for the crisis, and a lot of reasons for this. Also, the crisis in the world led to some slowdown or even decline in exports. It was not worse because of the public sector maintained in the 2008, 2009, but then in 2010, 2013, the exports start to resume again, but then you have the austerity phase in which the public sector contributed negatively to growth. And then you have a very strong negative contribution of the private sector with a moderate but negative contribution of the public sector, which was not worse because you have exports increasing in this period, but also a decrease in induced imports as is usual in recessions. And finally, the recovery to moderate growth, we have positive but more modest contributions of both public, external, and private demands. So here you can see the public sector is again the most important, and then you have the external sector and the private sector, but it's much more balanced than the other experience. Well, I have, I think, 4 minutes to discuss a little bit with the literature and conclude, so we can continue after this conversation. One difference that the authors gave much emphasis on residential investment boom, and I think, of course, it was very important to this result. But on the and also some authors characterize as demand-led private demand boom, as you saw yesterday. A lot of presentations here in this table with the countries. But of course, it's a different interpretation. Here is more narrow contribution on what's the accounting of demand-led growth. But also you have here the public sector as the most important. So of course, the public sector, the government spending didn't grow much more than the average, but as the share is very important, it's contributed more to growth compared to this. Of course, residential investment grew much more than the average in the period. And this result of public sector positive happened even with surplus primary balance, and then you have a different results of this contribution when compared to other authors that estimate these contributions by looking at the balances or the difference between expenditures and revenues. We also have a positive, although small, contribution of external sector, and also this is different than other ways to calculate this contribution based on net exports, because you have deficits in trade balance in Spain, but you have when you calculate one part in the supermultiplier and the other as autonomous demand, you have a positive impact, although small. Finally, I think, of course, the residential investment channel, direct channel, because of the low share of this component in demand, is not so important. But of course, one thing that could happen is that this generated a lot of revenues from the bubble and etc. And this, given a rule of primary surplus balance, led to a growth in the government expenditures and transfers that helped to boost this. Let's say it's like something like a super Avelmo, as it was named in Serrano and Pimentel. And also Ryan Woodgate shows something very similar. Okay, I think I have 1 minute. I think here we don't have much difference with the literature because of collapse of private demand, because of the crisis, financial crisis, that it's important to reduce the private demand, but also austerity sources. And finally, the recovery. I think one difference that, of course, exports were important to this recovery, but exports started before the 2014, and the recovery, the growth rate resume when you have also the positive contribution of the public sector and the private sector, which starts in 2014. Of course, there's a debate. What causes this is the internal devaluation. Some are in favor, some are contrary. The literature sometimes called this export-led, weak or mercantilism. But what we're stressing here that is what's not only exports, but also other components. So my final remarks, if I have 30 seconds, the contributions to growth. I would say there's some difference with the, I would say the supermultiplier would be narrower than the literature on growth regimes and growth drivers that combine not only the contributions of the components of demand to growth, but also financial and other explanations for this. So here is much more a demand-led accounting based on some more general and broad specific assumptions on which are induced and which are autonomous. I think we have implications we can discuss here. So I don't know how to characterize if you have in a period 3 components growing and contribution to growth. Do you call export-led or public sector-led, or if it's a combination of these? I don't know how to, I don't have much experience to work on this, and of course I would benefit from hearing from the audience, which is more, work more on this. Also, I think implications for distribution-led growth, that's you have autonomous changes both in distribution and components of demand. So you can have demand growing for political reasons and wage share falling for different reasons. You can have different patterns of these 2 kinds of. So I think I will stop here because I passed 2 minutes, and I would really like to hear your thoughts on this. Thank you.